Jonas knew the particular taste of dust and solitude that clung to the edges of Terra Seca, a settlement that barely clung to existence under a sun so merciless it seemed to leach the very color from the sky, leaving behind only shades of bleached bone and faded sepia. His skin, leathered by countless hours exposed to the elements, bore the indelible scent of dried sweat and ingrained grit, a perpetual reminder of a life lived on the fringes, far from the fleeting comforts of community. Yet it was the solitude that pressed heaviest, a constant companion echoing the deep, jagged wound of a trauma that had never truly healed, the memory of his sister, years vanished, condemned by the small, fearful minds of townsfolk who saw malevolence where there was only difference, whispers turning to accusations that clawed at innocence until it lay bleeding. He understood the chilling weight of injustice, the vast, silent indifference of the land that had swallowed desperate cries whole, just as it threatened to swallow everything else. This afternoon, however, the horizon shimmered not with heat haze alone, but with a turbulent growing cloud of agitated dust, an unmistakable harbinger of horse hooves and the furious, unthinking delirium of a mob. "Burn the witch!" The raw, guttural cries clawed at the air, distinct even from this distance, aiming their venom at the isolated shack where a reclusive woman, burdened by ancient superstitions, now made her solitary home. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, coiled in Jonas's gut, battling against the fiery indignation that pulsed with the vivid, searing memory of his sister's demise. The choice was stark, a treacherous chasm between cowardly omission, allowing history to repeat its cruel, immutable cycle, and the searing, unyielding memory of his own past failure, the image of burning wood, the rusted iron of chains, and the blind, unreasoning cruelty that had stolen her. He watched the approaching horde, a wave of distorted faces contorted by a collective malevolent will, their eyes fixed on the distant, vulnerable cabin, each man a willing participant in the unfolding tragedy. The wind, hot and laden with the grit of the plains, whipped around him, carrying the scent of their frenzied desperation. A stench as old as fear itself. With a decisive, practiced motion, the cowboy's hand moved, finding the familiar cold steel of his revolver in its worn leather holster. The weight, a surprising comfort, a promise of action against the creeping paralysis of memory. His gaze swept over the advancing men, a silent challenge in their faces, the urgent desire to protect the woman's innocence bubbling fiercely within him, or perhaps, more truthfully, the desperate, aching need to rewrite the bitter narrative of his own past. To finally break free from the shackles of regret, he inhaled deeply, the dry, earthy scent of Terra Seca filling his lungs, before uttering the words, stark and brutal, that only the unforgiving soil beneath his feet and the profound darkness in his own soul could truly comprehend, an utterance destined to momentarily freeze the encroaching madness. The raw declaration, a single resonant truth torn from the depths of Jonas's experience, had ripped through the cacophony of the mob's frenzy like a sudden gunshot in a quiet canyon, causing a ripple of bewildered silence to spread outwards from his rigid form. Their shouted epithets died on parched tongues, the eager momentum of their horses faltered, and the collective contorted mask of righteous fury began to crack, revealing individual faces etched with confusion, doubt, and a spark of nascent fear. Eyes, once blazing with unified malevolence, now darted nervously between Jonas, his drawn revolver glinting with ominous purpose, and the humble, silent cabin, their imagined source of evil momentarily forgotten under the oppressive weight of his unexpected challenge. The wind, which had moments ago fanned their rage, now seemed to whisper warnings through the dry grass, carrying only the faint creak of saddle leather and the rapid thumping of agitated hearts, a stark, unwelcome counterpoint to the bloodthirsty chorus they had so eagerly embraced. This abrupt, chilling pause born of a single man's defiant stand was not peace, but the volatile calm before a storm, a fragile interlude where blind vengeance grappled with the cold, hard logic of survival, leaving the mob momentarily paralyzed by their own. Within the crucible of that unbearable stillness, Jonas felt the phantom touch of old ashes on his skin, the acrid smoke of past horrors stinging his eyes. fueling a resolve that was both a shield and a burning brand against the encroaching tide of injustice. The cold steel of the Colt in his grip grounded him, its familiar weight a testament to the harsh lessons learned and the grim path ahead, while the relentless western sun beat down upon his hatless head, a physical manifestation of the fiery crucible in his soul. He tasted the dust, felt its fine grit coating his tongue, a taste that had become synonymous with struggle and loss, and knew with an absolute certainty that he would not yield, not an inch, not a breath, to the dark currents threatening to consume another innocent life. His sister's face, etched in the unforgiving landscape of his memory, rose unbidden, her terrified eyes a silent plea from beyond the grave, amplifying the desperate, righteous anger that now simmered beneath his calm exterior. The lone cabin, a mere huddle of weathered wood and chinked mud, remained a silent witness, unaware of the fragile boundary Jonas had drawn in the dust, a line that separated frenzied mob mentality from the brutal, unyielding truth of a single defiant conscience. Jonas's words, a quiet declaration yet cutting like glass, hung in the stifling air, abruptly stifling the frenzied shouts and replacing them with a thick, palpable silence that felt heavier than the relentless midday sun itself. The men at the vanguard of the mob, their faces still contorted by a volatile blend of righteous indignation and bloodthirsty excitement, faltered in their tracks, their collective momentum shattered not by brute force, but by the sheer unexpected weight of his utterance, a truth so raw and unforgiving that it stripped away the flimsy veneer of their collective bravado. A few of the horses, sensitive to the sudden shift in human tension, shied, nervously snorting and scuffing their hooves on the dry, cracked earth, their discordant movements a stark counterpoint to the profound human stillness that had descended. The omnipresent wind, a silent, impartial observer, continued to whip fine tendrils of dust around their worn boots, carrying the faint metallic scent of fear and the lingering stench of desperation. Each man, caught in the sudden, uncomfortable glare of Jonas's unwavering gaze, felt a distinct prickle of unease, a flicker of doubt, as if the very ground beneath them had subtly shifted, revealing not the witch they sought to condemn, but rather their own stark reflection in the harsh, unforgiving mirror of Jonas's quiet, formidable resolve. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, the collective breath of the mob seemingly caught in their throats, a precarious moment balanced precariously on the razor's edge of renewed, violent fury or an unprecedented, reluctant retreat. Jonas stood there, a solitary, unwavering silhouette etched against the relentless, blinding glare of the western sky. His heart, a steady, defiant drumbeat against his ribs, each powerful throb an echoing testament to his sister's last, unheard scream, the memory a bitter, incandescent ember glowing fiercely in the depths of his gut. The silence stretched, an unbearable yawning chasm between his solitary, desperate stand and the shifting, restless mass of humanity arrayed before him, their collective will fractured by the unsettling, raw honesty of his unexpected challenge, a brutal mirror reflecting their own darkest fears and ingrained hypocrisies back at them. He could taste the faint, phantom metallic tang of blood in his own mouth, a haunting echo from battles long past, knowing with a chilling certainty that this confrontation was as much an internal war waged within his very soul as it was an external struggle, a desperate, valiant attempt to redeem a past he could never change by protecting a future he still might. Within the precarious sanctuary of the cabin, the reclusive woman, pressed tightly against the rough-hewn wall, her breath shallow and quick, could distinctly hear the sudden cessation of the baying mob, the oppressive quiet that now permeated the air, a new, perhaps even more insidious terror replacing the old, as she wondered what unseen, mysterious force had managed to halt their relentless advance, a desperate, fragile tendril of hope flickering amidst the suffocating dread. The mob, their initial shock slowly, inexorably morphing into a simmering, deeply entrenched resentment, began to murmur, a low, guttural growl rising slowly from their ranks, the insidious first signs of their fractured resolve inexorably reforming, hardening into a new, more dangerous and determined will to reclaim their lost momentum and their collective, deeply bruised pride. The fragile quiet, born of Jonas's audacious defiance, began to fracture and dissipate like smoke in a stiff breeze, replaced by a low guttural thrumming that vibrated through the parched earth and into the very bones of the crowd, a collective growl of wounded pride and reawakened zeal. Their faces, momentarily slack with surprise, now tightened into masks of renewed fury, eyes glinting with a dangerous, fanatical light as they exchanged dark, knowing glances amongst themselves, seeking tacit approval for the violence that simmered just beneath their skin. A burly man, his sweat-stained shirt clinging to a barrel chest, stepped forward from the vanguard, his jaw clenched, the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat obscuring eyes that held a cold, unwavering conviction, and his voice, rough as splintered wood, pierced the air, demanding to know what right this lone drifter had to stand between them and their God-given retribution. The unspoken threat of swift, brutal reprisal, hanging heavy and palpable in the thickening, dust-laden air, a stark declaration that their bloodlust would not be so easily quelled or diverted. The mob, perceiving a chink in the initial shock, started to shuffle forward, a relentless, undulating tide of human malice. Jonas, his heart a steady drumbeat against his ribs, refused to yield his ground, the heavy, oiled steel of his Colt an anchor in his trembling but determined grip, its cold weight a constant, reassuring presence amidst the surging tide of animosity. He watched the burly man's advance, his gaze unwavering, acknowledging the challenge but refusing to be intimidated, a flicker of grim satisfaction perhaps, at having bought even this brief respite, knowing full well the price that would soon be demanded. The bitter tang of dust and dried sage on his tongue mingled with the ghostly scent of burning timber from a past he could never fully escape, sharpening his resolve, painting a vivid, agonizing picture of his sister's final, desperate moments, a memory that coiled like a viper in his gut and solidified his resolve to prevent history from repeating its cruel, unyielding cycle. He felt the insidious drag of his own weary limbs, the ache in his shoulders from endless days under the unforgiving sun, but pushed past it, his eyes, hard and unyielding as flint, already scanning the faces of the men, calculating angles, anticipating the first move, preparing his tired body and tormented soul for the brutal, inevitable dance that was about to unfold. The burly man, named Burl by the whispers that carried on the hot, dry breeze, finally moved, his face a mask of primal fury, contorted by a mixture of disbelief and affront that this lone figure dared to challenge their collective righteousness. The heavy silence which had swallowed Jonas's challenging words now stretched thin, punctuated only by the restless shuffle of horses' hooves against the sun-baked earth, the creak of saddle leather, and the incessant, frantic buzz of flies dancing in the oppressive heat, each sound amplifying the unbearable tension that vibrated like a taut wire across the dusty clearing. Every man in the mob, though momentarily stunned by Jonas's audacity, felt a slow, insidious burn rekindle in their blood, the initial shock giving way to a more potent, collective surge of fury, their hands instinctively dropping to the worn hafts of axes, the smooth grips of their pistols, or the rough timber of improvised clubs, a silent, menacing agreement passing between them, a shared readiness to enforce their will no matter the cost, a silent pact sealed in the suffocating air. Jonas could feel the myriad gazes, sharp as flint shards, pricking his skin, but his own eyes, hard and unwavering, remained fixed on Burl, the spearhead of their collective animosity, a silent challenge burning in their depths, daring him to make the first move, knowing that once that line was crossed, there would be no turning back from the bloody reckoning that loomed. Then, without a single word escaping his gritted teeth, the burly man lunged forward, a guttural roar tearing from the depths of his chest, his massive frame closing the distance with surprising, brutish speed. A gnarled, calloused fist already arcing through the air towards Jonas's head, aiming to knock the Colt from his grasp and render him helpless before the eager, seething mob could descend. Jonas's response was a blur, an instinct honed by a lifetime of hard knocks and the brutal, searing memory of helpless observation, a lightning-quick sidestep that barely avoided the wild, powerful swing, the displaced air stinging his cheek with its violent passage, and with a practiced, economical movement, the barrel of his Colt snapped upwards, not quite to strike, but to warn, the metallic click of the hammer being drawn back, echoing with chilling clarity in the sudden, suspended stillness that had fallen over the crowd. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet, but to disable, to show them the cold, hard consequence of their collective bloodlust, a desperate gamble to force them to consider the path of reason, or at least the stark reality of facing a man who had nothing left to lose but his own shattered conscience, and the acrid scent of fear mingled with the dry dust became almost palpable, thick in the suffocating air. Burl, though momentarily stunned by the sudden, almost animalistic speed of Jonas's defensive maneuver, his fist whistling harmlessly through the air where a moment before Jonas's head had been, quickly recovered his brutish equilibrium, his face contorting further into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his eyes small and piggish, glinting with a dangerous mix of affronted pride and simmering hatred beneath the brim of his dusty hat as he took a wary half-step back. The crowd, an amorphous beast of fear and superstition, had fallen into an unnerving silence, their collective breath held, a palpable tension thicker than the dust that clung to the air and coated the parched landscape, each individual face a tableau of uncertainty and dread, some shrinking back while others leaned forward, their anticipation a tangible thing, awaiting the next inevitable eruption of violence. Jonas stood his ground, unmoving as a weathered stone marker, the cold, smooth metal of the Colt, a natural extension of his arm, its hammer cocked back with a menacing readiness that spoke volumes without a single word being uttered, his gaze unwavering, fixed on Burl with an intensity that promised swift retribution should the man dare another reckless move, the acrid taste of impending conflict settling heavy on his tongue. The standoff stretched, a breathless eternity measured only by the distant, mournful creak of a windmill and the relentless thrum of cicadas, as Burl's chest heaved with suppressed rage, his eyes darting between Jonas's steady hand and the weapon it held, then back to the faces of his wavering followers, a silent plea for them to push past the sudden fear that Jonas's defiance had sown among them. A low murmur rippled through the mob, a restless shifting of feet on the baked earth, some of the more timid souls beginning to edge away from the front, their fervor momentarily cooled by the stark, undeniable presence of a man willing to kill to protect what he deemed right. Jonas's own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of the past, the scent of burning wood and helpless screams momentarily searing his memory, strengthening his resolve, reminding him of the terrible cost of inaction. He would not allow this day to end in the same ashes as that other one, and his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the Colt's grip, a silent pledge to the spectral memory of his lost sister. Burl's throat worked, a dry, rasping sound, lost amidst the vast, silent judgment of the sun-baked plains, his face a mottled canvas of disbelief and thwarted fury, the sudden sharp scent of his own fear, a bitter tang in his mouth as he wrestled with the indignity of being outmaneuvered by a man he'd dismissed as a ghost. The mob, a serpentine mass of shadowed figures behind him, seemed to shrink under Jonas's unwavering gaze, their collective will fractured by the sight of cold steel and the undeniable authority in the cowboy's stance, their earlier shouts of righteous zeal now replaced by an uneasy quiet, punctuated only by the scuff of boots and the nervous shifting of bodies. Each tick of time felt like an anvil striking the earth, heavy and final, as Jonas absorbed their wavering, the flicker of doubt in their eyes a small victory, a tiny ember of hope against the conflagration of their hatred. Yet he knew the beast of blind faith could reignite in an instant, and his own blood still thrummed with the phantom echo of distant screams, a grim melody that fueled his resolve to protect the secluded woman, whose very breath seemed to hang suspended in the oppressive, dust-laden air within the shack. A strained silence held the world captive, the only sound the persistent buzz of flies circling a discarded tin can near the cabin's porch, and the faint, almost imperceptible shiver of dry leaves on a skeletal mesquite tree, as Burl, still simmering with indignant rage, finally found his voice, a low growl that tore through the parched air. "You ain't gonna stop all of us, Jonas. There's more than one devil to be purged from this land." His words, meant to rally his wavering followers, carried a hollow echo, failing to rekindle the frenzied certainty that had propelled them moments before, their gazes still fixed on the cold, unflinching resolve in Jonas's eyes. The metallic gleam of the Colt, a stark, unyielding promise. Jonas merely stared back, his expression a mask carved from granite, the memory of his sister's desperately a silent, searing mantra in his soul, knowing that to falter now, even for a breath, would be to betray not just the woman behind him, but the very ghost of innocence he had failed to save so many years ago. And he would stand until the sun bled from the sky, or his own blood soaked the thirsty earth. The mob's initial fury, stoked by Burl's venomous words, flickered like a dying ember, unable to ignite into the full blaze of murderous intent that he so desperately craved. Their eyes, once alight with righteous indignation, now held a glint of uncertainty, caught between the sheer force of Jonas's silent, unwavering will and the lingering whispers of their own ingrained superstitions, the raw courage radiating from the lone Cowboy was a palpable force, pressing down on them with the weight of an unseen hand, a stark counterpoint to the hollow bravado Burl attempted to project. His face contorted into a mask of impotent rage, the veins in his neck bulging under the leathery skin as he scowled, unable to comprehend why his words, usually so potent in whipping up fear and hatred, were failing him now. The sun, a malevolent eye in the vast bleached sky, beat down relentlessly, making the very air shimmer and dance, with an oppressive heat that seemed to drain the last vestiges of their collective bloodlust, leaving behind only the uncomfortable awareness of their own complicity and the chilling conviction in Jonas's stance. Jonas, meanwhile, felt the relentless ache in his gun arm, a phantom pain that mirrored the one in his soul, but his grip on the Colt remained as steady as the ancient stones of the mesas, each throb a reminder of the years he had spent silently carrying the burden of his sister's fate, a silent vow etched into the very marrow of his bones. He tasted the metallic tang of dust on his tongue, the gritty texture clinging to the roof of his mouth, and beneath it, the bitter flavor of memory, the scent of burning wood and despair still vivid in his mind's eye, a stark visceral tableau against the stark reality of the present moment. He watched the flicker of doubt pass through the mob, a fleeting shadow across their sun-baked faces, and a tiny spark of something akin to hope, fragile as spun glass, briefly ignited within him, swiftly extinguished by the cold, hard knowledge that fanaticism, once roused, rarely retreated without a cost, and he was prepared to pay it, whatever the toll. Burl, his face now a mask of frustrated fury, felt the reins of his authority slipping through his fingers like fine sand, each desperate shout to rekindle the dying embers of the mob's righteous indignation falling flat against the oppressive silence that Jonas's unwavering presence had wrought. The collective tension, once a throbbing pulse of shared malice, had begun to fray at the edges, dissolving into individual pockets of unease, men shuffling their feet, avoiding the gaze of their neighbors, the metallic glint in their eyes replaced by a flicker of doubt as the sun continued its slow, merciless descent, a collective cough, a nervous clearing of a throat. These small human sounds punctuated the heavy quiet, each one a tiny chip in the dam of their fanaticism, while the acrid smell of horse sweat and the ever-present dust, stirred by their earlier charge, now settled thick in the air, coating tongues and grating on already raw nerves, an unspoken indictment of their own halted momentum. Jonas, observing the subtle cracks forming in the mob's unified front, allowed a flicker of grim satisfaction to cross his features, though it was swiftly replaced by the customary hardness, for he knew all too well how quickly a wavering resolve could be whipped back into a frenzy by a single desperate voice, especially one fueled by the gnawing fear of being perceived as weak. His eyes, though fixed on Burl's sputtering rage, held within them the distant echo of a younger sister's plea, a sound that transcended time and distance, connecting him irrevocably to the silent woman cowering within the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, whose fate now rested entirely upon the cold, steady weight of the Colt in his hand. The whisper of the wind through the dry, yellowed sagebrush carried not only the faint metallic scent of the distant mountains, but also the premonition of violence, a silent agreement between the vast, indifferent land and the desperate, determined man, ready to face whatever consequence the deepening twilight would bring. The last vestiges of Burl's authority, always tenuous and rooted more in shared delusion than genuine respect, finally fractured under the unwavering pressure of Jonas's silent defiance and the growing unease among the less fanatical members of the mob, whose initial fervor had been steadily eroded by the passing minutes and the stark reality of the armed man before them. A few shifted their weight, their boots scuffing the parched earth with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the sudden charged quiet, their gazes darting towards the ground, towards their neighbors, anywhere but into the deep, unforgiving pools of Jonas's eyes that promised only resolute opposition and the very real possibility of swift, decisive violence. The shared delusion, which had propelled them forward with such righteous indignation, now began to unravel, exposing the raw, individual fear that had always lurked beneath, whispering doubts about the true wickedness of the recluse woman, and more pressingly, the wisdom of challenging a man who had already proven his willingness to stand alone against their collective might. Burl, his face a contorted mask of frustrated fury and dawning impotence, let out a guttural growl that dissolved into a choked whisper, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly as he finally recognized the battle was lost, not to Jonas's superior numbers, for there were none, but to the slow, insidious erosion of his own followers' conviction. With a final venomous glare directed not at Jonas, but at the retreating backs of his increasingly disloyal adherents, he turned, stumbling rather than walking, back into the swirling dust cloud from which they had all emerged, the unified force of the mob dissolving into disparate figures, melting away into the deepening twilight. Jonas watched them go, his breath finally hitching, a long, ragged gasp escaping his lungs, his arm, which had held the Colt steady for so long, trembling almost imperceptibly as the tension, stretched thin like a worn leather strap, finally snapped, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He stood for a moment longer amidst the settling dust, the silent victor of a battle fought not with bullets, but with unwavering will, the heavy weight of his past momentarily lightened by the small, precious triumph of this bitter, dusty afternoon.